Here are the 10 most deadly eras in history. Number 10. Partition of India. The partition of India in 1947 was the change of political borders and the division of other assets that accompanied the dissolution of the British Raj in the Indian subcontinent, and the creation of two independent dominions in South Asia, India and Pakistan. The Dominion of India is today the Republic of India, and the Dominion of Pakistan, which at the time comprised two regions lying on either side of India, is now the Islamic Republic of Pakistan and the People's Republic of Bangladesh. The partition was outlined in the Indian Independence Act 1947. The change of political borders notably included the division of two provinces of British India, Bengal and Punjab. The majority Muslim districts in these provinces were awarded to Pakistan, and the majority non-Muslim to India. The other assets that were divided included the British Indian Army, the Royal Indian Navy, the Royal Indian Air Force, the Indian Civil Service, the railways, and the Central Treasury. Provisions for self-governing independent Pakistan and India legally came into existence at midnight on 1945, 14th and 15th of August respectively. The partition caused large-scale loss of life, and an unprecedented migration between the two dominions. Among refugees who survived, it solidified the belief that safety lay among co-religionists. In the instance of Pakistan, it made palpable a hitherto only imagined refuge for the Muslims of British India. The migrations took place hastily and with little warning. It is thought that between 14 million and 18 million people moved, and perhaps more. Excess mortality during the period of the partition is usually estimated to have been around 1 million. On January 13, 1948, Mahatma Gandhi started his fast with the goal of stopping the violence. He ended his fast on January 18, at the urging of various religious and political leaders, who pledged to put an end to the violence and uphold communal harmony. Number 9. Russo-Ukraine War. The ongoing Russo-Ukrainian War began in 2014 of February. Following Ukraine's Revolution of Dignity, Russia occupied and annexed Crimea from Ukraine and supported pro-Russian separatists fighting the Ukrainian military in the Donbas War. These first 8 years of conflict also included naval incidents and cyber warfare. In 2022 of February, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine and began occupying more of the country, starting the biggest conflict in Europe since World War II. The war has resulted in a refugee crisis, and tens of thousands of deaths. In early 2014, the Euromaidan protests led to the Revolution of Dignity and the ousting of Ukraine's pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych. Shortly after, pro-Russian unrest erupted in eastern and southern Ukraine, while unmarked Russian troops occupied Crimea. Russia then annexed Crimea after a highly disputed referendum. In 2014 of April, Russian-backed militants seized towns in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region and proclaimed the Donetsk People's Republic, DPR, and the Luhansk People's Republic, LPR, as independent states, starting the Donbas War. Russia covertly supported the separatists with its own troops, tanks and artillery, preventing Ukraine from fully retaking the territory. In 2015 of February, Russia and Ukraine signed the Minsk II agreements, but they were never fully implemented in the years that followed. The Donbas War settled into a violent but static conflict between Ukraine and the Russian and separatist forces, with many brief ceasefires but no lasting peace and few changes in territorial control. Beginning in 2021, there was a massive Russian military buildup near Ukraine's borders, including within neighboring Belarus. Russian officials repeatedly denied plans to attack Ukraine. Russia's President Vladimir Putin expressed irredentist views and denied Ukraine's right to exist. He demanded that Ukraine be barred from ever joining the NATO military alliance. In early 2022, Russia recognized the DPR and LPR as independent states. On February 24 of 2022, Putin announced a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, claiming Russia had no plans to occupy the country. The Russian invasion that followed was internationally condemned. Many countries imposed sanctions against Russia, and sent humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine. In the face of fierce resistance, Russia abandoned an attempt to take Kyiv in early April. From August, Ukrainian forces began recapturing territories in the northeast and south. In late September, Russia declared the annexation of 4 partially occupied provinces, which was internationally condemned. Since then, Russian offensives and Ukrainian counteroffensives have gained only small amounts of territory. The invasion has also led to attacks in Russia, by Ukrainian and Ukrainian-backed forces, among them a cross-border incursion, into Russia's Kursk Oblast in 2024 of August. Russia has repeatedly carried out deliberate and indiscriminate attacks on civilians far from the front line. The International Criminal Court, ICC, opened an investigation into war crimes and issued arrest warrants for Putin and several other Russian officials. Number 8, 2005 and the AIDS epidemic. The global pandemic of HIV/AIDS began in 1981, and is an ongoing worldwide public health issue. According to the World Health Organization (WHO), by 2023, HIV/AIDS had killed approximately 40.4 million people, and approximately 39 million people were infected with HIV globally. AIDS denialist policies have impeded the creation of effective programs for distribution of antiretroviral drugs. Denialist policies by former South African President Thabo Mbeki's administration led to several 100,000 unnecessary deaths. UNAIDS estimates that in 2005 there were 5.5 million people in South Africa infected with HIV, 12.4% of the population. According to a graph done by UNAIDS, there were 4.2 million people living with HIV in South Africa in 2005. This was an increase of 400,000 people since 2003. As of 2018, the prevalence of HIV in Eastern and Southern Africa combined was 1.8 million. This number only represents children and adolescents, ages 0 to 19. As for those ages 15 to 24 in this region of Africa, the incidence rate in 2018 was 290,000. About 203,000 of those infected were females. The statistical release form in the Republic of South Africa in 2020 states that the prevalence rate of HIV infections among adults ages 15 to 49 was 18.7%. But the overall population in South Africa has a prevalence rate of 13%. As of 2021, UNAIDS data from the eastern and southern countries in Africa showed the HIV prevalence rate to be 6.2% in adults ages 15 to 49. Since the first cases of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome were reported in 1981, infection with human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, has grown to pandemic proportions, resulting in an estimated 65 million infections and 25 million deaths. During 2005 alone, an estimated 2.8 million persons died from AIDS, 4.1 million were newly infected with HIV, and 38.6 million were living with HIV. HIV continues to disproportionately affect certain geographic regions, example Sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean, and subpopulations, example women in Sub-Saharan Africa, men who have sex with men, injection drug users and sex workers. Effective prevention and treatment of HIV infection with antiretroviral therapy are now available, even in countries with limited resources. Nonetheless, comprehensive programs are needed to reach all persons who require treatment, and to prevent transmission of new infections. Number 7, Second Congo War, 1998 to 2003. The Second Congo War, also known as Africa's World War or the Great War of Africa, was a major conflict that began on 1998 the 2nd of August in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. Just over a year after the First Congo War. The war initially erupted when Congolese President, Laurent Désiré Kabila, turned against his former allies from Rwanda and Uganda, who had helped him seize power. Eventually, the conflict expanded, drawing in 9 African nations and approximately 25 armed groups, making it one of the largest wars in African history. Although a peace agreement was signed in 2002, and the war officially ended on 2003 18th of July with the establishment of the Transitional Government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, violence has persisted in various regions, particularly in the east, through ongoing conflicts such as the Lord's Resistance Army insurgency and the Kivu and Ituri conflicts. The Second Congo War and its aftermath caused an estimated 5.4 million deaths, primarily due to disease and malnutrition, making it the deadliest conflict since World War II, according to a 2008 report by the International Rescue Committee. However, this figure has been disputed, with some researchers arguing that many of the deaths may have occurred regardless of the war. The conflict also displaced approximately 2 million people, forcing them to flee their homes or seek asylum in neighboring countries. Additionally, the war was heavily funded by the trade of conflict minerals, which continues to fuel violence in the region. Number 6. The 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, was one of the most destructive conflicts in European history. Fought primarily in Central Europe, an estimated 4.5 to 8 million soldiers and civilians died from the effects of battle, famine, or disease, while parts of Germany reported population declines of over 50%. The war can be seen as a continuation of the religious conflict initiated by the 16th century Reformation within the Holy Roman Empire. The 1555 Peace of Augsburg attempted to resolve this by dividing the empire into Catholic and Lutheran states, but over the next 50 years the expansion of Protestantism beyond these boundaries destabilized the settlement. However, while differences over religion and imperial authority were important factors in causing the war, some contemporary commentators suggest its scope and extent were driven by the contest for European dominance between Habsburg-ruled Spain, Austria, and the French House of Bourbon. Its outbreak is generally traced to 1618, when Emperor Ferdinand II was deposed as King of Bohemia and replaced by the Protestant Frederick V of the Palatinate. Although imperial forces quickly suppressed the Bohemian revolt, Frederick's participation expanded the fighting into the Palatinate, whose strategic importance grew in the Dutch Republic and Spain, then engaged in the 80 Years' War. In addition, the acquisition of territories within the empire by rulers like Christian IV of Denmark and Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, gave them and other foreign powers an ongoing motive to intervene. Combined with fears the Protestant religion in general was threatened, what started as an internal dynastic dispute became a European conflict. The period from 1618 to 1635 was primarily a civil war within the Holy Roman Empire, with support from external powers. After 1635, the empire became one theater in a wider struggle between France, chiefly supported by Sweden, and Emperor Ferdinand III, whose principal ally was Spain. Fighting ended with the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, the terms of which included greater autonomy within the empire for states like Bavaria and Saxony, as well as acceptance of Dutch independence by Spain. The conflict shifted the balance of power in favor of France, and set the stage for the expansionist wars of Louis XIV, which dominated Europe for the next 60 years. The total count of civilian casualties was around 3.5 million to 6.5 million. Number 5. 1959 and China's Great Famine. The Great Chinese Famine was a famine that occurred between 1959 and 1961, in the People's Republic of China, PRC. It is widely regarded as the deadliest famine and one of the greatest man-made disasters in human history, with an estimated death toll due to starvation that ranges in the tens of millions, 15 to 55 million. The most stricken provinces were Anhui, 18% dead, Chongqing, 15%, Sichuan, 13%, Guizhou, 11%, and Hunan, 8%. The major contributing factors in the famine were the policies of the Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1962, and People's Communes, launched by chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong, such as inefficient distribution of food within the nation's planned economy, requiring the use of poor agricultural techniques, the Four Pests campaign that reduced sparrow populations, which disrupted the ecosystem, over-reporting of grain production, and ordering millions of farmers to switch to iron and steel production. During the 7,000 Cadres Conference in early 1962, Liu Shaoqi, then President of China, formally attributed 30% of the famine to natural disasters, and 70% to man-made errors. After the launch of reforms and opening up, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, officially stated in 1981 of June, that the famine was mainly due to the mistakes of the Great Leap Forward, as well as the anti-rightist campaign, in addition to some natural disasters and the Sino-Soviet split. Number 4, 1346 and the Black Death. The Black Death was a bubonic plague pandemic that occurred in Europe from 1346 to 1353. It was one of the most fatal pandemics in human history, as many as 50 million people perished, perhaps 50% of Europe's 14th century population. The disease is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and spread by fleas and through the air. One of the most significant events in European history, the Black Death had far-reaching population, economic, and cultural impacts. It was the beginning of the Second Plague pandemic. The plague created religious, social and economic upheavals, with profound effects on the course of European history. The origin of the Black Death is disputed. Genetic analysis suggests Yersinia pestis bacteria evolved approximately 7,000 years ago, at the beginning of the Neolithic, with flea-mediated strains emerging around 3,800 years ago during the Late Bronze Age. The immediate territorial origins of the Black Death and its outbreak remain unclear, with some evidence pointing towards Central Asia, China, the Middle East, and Europe. The pandemic was reportedly first introduced to Europe, during the siege of the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in Crimea, by the Golden Horde army of Yani Beg in 1347. From Crimea, it was most likely carried by fleas living on the black rats that traveled on Genoese ships, spreading through the Mediterranean basin and reaching North Africa, West Asia, and the rest of Europe via Constantinople, Sicily, and the Italian peninsula. There is evidence that once it came ashore, the Black Death mainly spread from person to person as pneumonic plague, thus explaining the quick inland spread of the epidemic, which was faster than would be expected if the primary vector was rat fleas causing bubonic plague. In 2022, it was discovered that there was a sudden surge of deaths in what is today Kyrgyzstan from the Black Death in the late 1330s, when combined with genetic evidence. It implies that the initial spread may not have been due to Mongol conquests in the 14th century, as previously speculated. The Black Death was the second great natural disaster to strike Europe during the late Middle Ages, the first one being the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and is estimated to have killed 30% to 60% of the European population, as well as approximately 33% of the population of the Middle East. There were further outbreaks throughout the late Middle Ages, and also due to other contributing factors, the European population did not regain its 14th century level until the 16th century. Outbreaks of the plague recurred around the world until the early 19th century. Number 3, World War II and the Holocaust, 1942. The Holocaust was the genocide of European Jews during World War II. Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its collaborators systematically murdered some 6 million Jews across German-occupied Europe, around two-thirds of Europe's Jewish population. The murders were carried out primarily through mass shootings and poison gas in extermination camps, chiefly Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, and Chelmno in occupied Poland. Separate Nazi persecutions killed a similar or larger number of non-Jewish civilians and prisoners of war, POWs. The term Holocaust is sometimes used to refer to the persecution of these other groups. The Nazis developed their ideology based on racism and pursuit of living space, and seized power in early 1933. Meant to force all German Jews regardless of means to attempt to emigrate, the regime passed anti-Jewish laws, encouraged harassment, and orchestrated a nationwide pogrom, in November of 1938. After Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, occupation authorities began to establish ghettos to segregate Jews. Following the June 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, 1.5 to 2 million Jews were shot by German forces and local collaborators. Later in 1941 or early 1942, the highest levels of the German government decided to murder all Jews in Europe. Victims were deported by rail to extermination camps, where if they survived the journey, most were killed with poison gas. Other Jews continued to be employed in forced labor camps, where many died from starvation, abuse, exhaustion, or being used as test subjects in deadly medical experiments. Although many Jews tried to escape, surviving in hiding was difficult due to factors such as the lack of money to pay helpers and the risk of denunciation. The property, homes, and jobs belonging to murdered Jews were redistributed to the German occupiers and other non-Jews. Although the majority of Holocaust victims died in 1942, the killing continued at a lower rate until the end of the war in May 1945. Many Jewish survivors emigrated outside of Europe after the war. A few Holocaust perpetrators faced criminal trials. Billions of dollars in reparations have been paid, although falling short of the Jews' losses. The Holocaust has also been commemorated in museums, memorials, and culture. It has become central to Western historical consciousness, as a symbol of the ultimate human evil. Number 2, Volcanic Winter of 536. The volcanic winter of 536 was the most severe and protracted episode of climatic cooling in the Northern Hemisphere in the last 2,000 years. The volcanic winter was caused by at least 3 simultaneous eruptions of uncertain origin, with several possible locations proposed in various continents. Most contemporary accounts of the volcanic winter are from authors in Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, although the impact of the cooler temperatures extended beyond Europe. Modern scholarship has determined that in early AD 536, or possibly late 535, an eruption ejected massive amounts of sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere, which reduced the solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface and cooled the atmosphere for several years. In March 536, Constantinople began experiencing darkened skies and lower temperatures. Summer temperatures in 536 fell down to 2.5 degrees Celsius below normal in Europe. The lingering impact of the volcanic winter of 536 was augmented in 539 to 540, when another volcanic eruption caused summer temperatures to decline, as much as 2.7 degrees Celsius below normal in Europe. There is evidence of still another volcanic eruption in 547, which would have extended the cool period. The volcanic eruptions caused crop failures, and were accompanied by the plague of Justinian, famine, and millions of deaths and initiated the late Antique Little Ice Age, which lasted from 536 to 560. The medieval scholar Michael McCormick wrote that 536 was the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year. And number 1, the Spanish flu. The 1918 to 1920 flu pandemic, also known as the Great Influenza Epidemic, or by the common misnomer Spanish flu, was an exceptionally deadly global influenza pandemic, caused by the H1N1 subtype of the influenza A virus. The earliest documented case was 1918 of March, in the state of Kansas in the United States, with further cases recorded in France, Germany and the United Kingdom in April. 2 years later, nearly a third of the global population, or an estimated 500 million people, had been infected in 4 successive waves. Estimates of deaths ranged from 17 million to 50 million, and possibly as high as 100 million, making it one of the deadliest pandemics in history. The pandemic broke out near the end of World War I, when wartime censors in the belligerent countries suppressed bad news to maintain morale, but newspapers freely reported the outbreak in neutral Spain, creating a false impression of Spain as the epicenter and leading to the Spanish flu misnomer. Limited historical epidemiological data make the pandemic's geographic origin indeterminate, with competing hypotheses on the initial spread. Most influenza outbreaks disproportionately kill the young and old, with a higher survival rate in between, but this pandemic had unusually high mortality for young adults. Scientists offer several explanations for the high mortality, including a 6-year climate anomaly affecting migration of disease vectors with increased likelihood of spread through bodies of water. However, the claim that young adults had a high mortality during the pandemic has been contested. Malnourishment, overcrowded medical camps and hospitals, and poor hygiene, exacerbated by the war, promoted bacterial superinfection, killing most of the victims after a typically prolonged deathbed. The 1918 Spanish flu was the first of 3 flu pandemics caused by H1N1 influenza A virus, the others being the 1977 Russian flu, and the 2009 swine flu pandemics. Please like, share and subscribe. And stay tuned for the next video.